In March of 1875, in the coal mining town of Ashwood Hollow, Pennsylvania, a crew of railroad workers unearthed something that would force the sealing of 17 boxes of county records for the next 43 years. They were laying track through what had been marked on old surveys as Crowley's South Pasture when the ground collapsed beneath a steam engine. What the workers initially believed to be an abandoned mine shaft proved to be something far worse. The cavity extended 30 feet down into darkness, and the smell that rose from it sent 3 men stumbling away to vomit in the spring grass. Sheriff William Garrett descended on rope with 2 deputies and 4 lanterns. What he documented in his official report, later sealed by court order, was a chamber approximately 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. The walls were stone, carefully mortared. Iron rings had been driven into those walls at precise intervals, each 5 feet apart, creating a grid pattern around the entire underground room. Shackles hung from 23 of those rings. 12 of them still contained human remains. The bones showed signs of prolonged restraint. Wrist bones bore deep grooves where iron had pressed against living flesh for weeks or months. Several skeletons remained in positions suggesting the victims had died while still chained. Most disturbing to the sheriff was a detail he would refuse to speak about publicly for the rest of his life. The scratches on the stone walls, some shallow, some deep enough to have broken fingernails, all concentrated at exactly the height a standing person could reach while shackled at the wrists. The railroad company wanted to fill the chamber immediately and continue construction. The county coroner, Dr. Raymond Finch, insisted on a full examination. He cataloged the remains over 3 days, working by lamplight in that underground horror. His findings were precise: 12 victims, ages ranging from approximately 16 to 40 years. 8 appeared to be male, 4 female. Time of death varied, but all had been deceased for at least 15 years, some possibly as long as 30. Every single skeleton bore marks on the wrist and ankle bones consistent with prolonged shackling. The property deed revealed that the land had belonged to Isaac Crowley, Ashwood Hollow's most respected blacksmith, who had died in 1873. For 32 years, from 1841 to 1873, Isaac Crowley had operated his forge just 300 yards from this hidden chamber. He had shod the horses of judges and ministers. He had crafted the iron fence around the Presbyterian church. His work had been known throughout 3 counties for its exceptional quality and artistry. He had also forged shackles, beautiful, terrible shackles. Shackles designed not for the quick restraint of prisoners, but for something far worse. The question that haunted Sheriff Garrett, that would eventually drive him to resign his position and leave Ashwood Hollow forever, was simple and terrible. Why had Isaac Crowley kept people chained underground? And more disturbing still, where were the other 11 sets of shackles occupants? Because the chamber had been designed to hold 23 victims, and only 12 bodies had been found. Before we continue with the horrifying truth about Isaac Crowley and what happened in that underground chamber, if this story intrigues you, or perhaps disturbs you in ways you can't quite explain, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. This isn't just another true crime channel. What we're uncovering here, what we're about to reveal about Isaac Crowley, comes from sealed records, from documents that were deliberately hidden from the public for nearly half a century. These aren't stories you'll find in your typical history books. This is the history they didn't want you to know. And click that notification bell, because the deeper we dig into Ashwood Hollow, the darker this story becomes. Trust me when I tell you that what you've heard so far is only the beginning. Those 11 missing victims, we're going to find out exactly what happened to them, and the truth is far worse than an unmarked grave. This content is only for the bravest among you. only for true mystery seekers who can handle the reality of what human beings are capable of when they believe no one is watching. So tell me in the comments right now, what state or city are you watching from? Are you brave enough to see this through to the end? Because once you know the full truth about Isaac Crowley, you'll never forget it. Now let's go back to where this nightmare began. To Ashwood Hollow in 1841, when Isaac Crowley first arrived in town. Ashwood Hollow in 1841 was not yet the prosperous mining town it would become by the 1860s. It was a struggling settlement of approximately 340 souls, clustered along Blackwater Creek in the anthracite coal region of northeastern Pennsylvania. The population consisted primarily of German and Welsh immigrants, with a smaller number of Irish families who had arrived during the previous decade's economic troubles. The town's economy teetered on the edge of failure. Two small coal operations provided inconsistent work for perhaps 60 men. Most families subsisted on small-scale farming, logging, or trades. The nearest substantial town was Hazleton, 17 miles south along roads that became impassable during winter months and spring thaws. This isolation was both Ashwood Hollow's curse and its defining characteristic. Communication with the outside world happened irregularly. Mail arrived twice weekly when weather permitted, sometimes not for weeks during harsh winters. Newspapers from Philadelphia or Harrisburg were often 6 to 8 weeks old by the time they reached Ashwood Hollow. The town had no telegraph office until 1869. In practical terms, Ashwood Hollow existed in a bubble of geographic and temporal isolation, a place where events could unfold unseen by the broader world. The social structure was simple and rigid. Reverend Thomas Blackwell of the Presbyterian Church served as the moral authority. Mayor Hugh Donovan, who also ran the town's only general store, handled civic matters with minimal oversight from the county seat. Dr. Abraham Yoder, trained in Philadelphia before settling in Ashwood Hollow in 1838, was the only physician within 20 miles. The sheriff, in those years before William Garrett, was a man named Joseph Klein, who served more as a keeper of the peace than as any kind of investigator. Into this isolated, insular community walked Isaac Crowley in April of 1841. He arrived on a Wednesday morning, driving a wagon loaded with blacksmithing tools of exceptional quality. He was 31 years old, tall and broad-shouldered as one would expect of a blacksmith, with dark hair and darker eyes that neighbors would later describe as thoughtful and melancholy. He spoke with a refined accent that suggested education, unusual for a tradesman. He told the story of his origins freely. Born in Lancaster, trained by his father in the blacksmith's trade, widowed young when his wife Sarah died of consumption, seeking a fresh start away from painful memories. Every detail of this story was a lie, but no one in Ashwood Hollow had any way to verify it. Lancaster was 130 miles away, might as well have been 1,000, and Isaac Crowley was exactly what the struggling town needed. Within a week, he had leased property on the eastern edge of town from a widow named Mrs. Catherine Brenner. The property included a small house and, crucially, an existing structure that had once served as a stable. Crowley announced his intention to convert it into a proper smithy. He paid 6 months' lease in advance, in silver coin, which immediately established him as a man of means in a town where most transactions involved credit or barter. The transformation of the old stable into a working forge took Crowley 3 months. He worked alone, accepting no help even when neighbors offered. This was attributed to the pride of a skilled craftsman who wanted things done correctly. The building that emerged was impressive. Stone walls 2 feet thick, a chimney that drew perfectly, a slate roof that wouldn't spark and catch fire. The forge itself was a masterwork, built to specifications Crowley had apparently designed himself. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that during those 3 months, Isaac Crowley was also digging. The soil around Ashwood Hollow was difficult, rocky, dense with clay, stubborn. Excavating a chamber 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, 30 feet deep, would have required moving approximately 24,000 cubic feet of earth and stone. For a single man working in secret, this should have been impossible. But Crowley had time, and he had method, and he had something else, a complete absence of conscience. He dug at night, by lamplight, working in the underground space that extended from beneath his forge. The excavated soil scattered gradually across his property, using it to level the ground, build up areas around the foundation, and create what appeared to be normal landscaping. The work took him not 3 months, but nearly 8. The forge opened for business in July, but the chamber wasn't completed until late autumn. By the time winter arrived, Isaac Crowley had established himself as an essential member of the Ashwood Hollow community. His work was excellent, truly excellent. He could repair a broken plow blade so the mend was stronger than the original metal. He could shoe a difficult horse with patience and skill. He crafted iron hinges, latches, and locks with artistry that elevated them beyond mere function. Reverend Blackwell commissioned him to create a new bell mounting for the church. Mayor Donovan ordered an ornamental sign for the general store. Dr. Yoder had him fashion a set of surgical instruments to replace ones lost in a house fire. Each piece Crowley delivered exceeded expectations. He attended church every Sunday, sitting in the back pew, singing hymns in a clear baritone. He was courteous to women, respectful to men, and patient with children. He drank moderately at Mayor's Tavern on Saturday evenings, never to excess, and proved himself an educated conversationalist who could discuss politics, philosophy, and literature. He was, by all accounts, a model citizen. Perhaps a bit private, a bit reserved, but this was attributed to his grief over his dead wife. The sadness in his eyes only made him more sympathetic, particularly to the unmarried women of the town and their matchmaking mothers. No one suspected. How could they? The chamber beneath his property was accessible only through a carefully concealed entrance inside the forge itself, hidden beneath the massive iron plate where he banked his coals at night. The entrance was designed with such precision that no crack or seam showed. The ventilation shaft was disguised as a drainage culvert running downhill toward the creek, its opening hidden in dense undergrowth 100 yards from the forge. Isaac Crowley had built a perfect prison, and by the winter of 1841 he was ready to fill it. The question of why discovery was delayed, why this horror operated undisturbed for 3 decades, has a simple answer. Isaac Crowley chose his victims with the same careful precision he applied to his metalwork. He selected people whose disappearance would cause minimal disruption. People whose absence might be noted but never thoroughly investigated. People whom the world had already begun to forget. Isaac Crowley's public life was a masterpiece of calculated normalcy. Every action, every relationship, every gesture served to reinforce the image of a skilled, melancholic, utterly trustworthy craftsman who had found a new home in Ashwood Hollow. He joined the Volunteer Fire Brigade in the spring of 1842, responding to 3 barn fires and a house fire over the next 2 years. He risked his own safety, pulling the Schneider family's youngest child from their burning home in 1844. The gratitude of the Schneiders and the respect this earned him proved invaluable. Men who trust you with their children's lives do not easily suspect you of evil. His charitable work was conspicuous but not ostentatious. He repaired farm equipment for widows at no charge. When the Presbyterian Church needed funds for a new roof in 1846, Crowley donated generously and spent 2 weeks crafting decorative ironwork for the doors without compensation. Reverend Blackwell praised him publicly as a man of Christian virtue and charitable spirit. The Reverend had no idea that the iron rings being mortared into the stone walls of Crowley's underground chamber were forged with the same skill and care as the church's decorative hinges. Crowley's relationship with authority figures in Ashwood Hollow was particularly strategic. He cultivated genuine friendships with the men who might otherwise pose a threat to his activities. Sheriff Joseph Klein became a regular visitor to the forge. Klein was a simple man, honest but unimaginative, better suited to breaking up tavern fights than conducting investigations. Crowley repaired his firearms, maintained his wagon, and never charged full price. More importantly, he listened. Klein would stop by the forge 2 or 3 times weekly, ostensibly to have Crowley look at some piece of equipment, but really to talk. Crowley became his confidant, the educated man who could discuss Klein's frustrations with the job, his worries about his children, his opinions on town politics. When people occasionally went missing from the surrounding area, Klein would mention it to Crowley. "Damned strange," he would say. "That drifter who was working at the Morrison farm just up and disappeared. Left his wages behind." And Crowley would nod sympathetically, offer some theory about the man moving on, perhaps being wanted elsewhere, perhaps falling into the creek drunk. Klein trusted these theories because he trusted Crowley. The sheriff never knew that the drifter was shackled in the darkness 30 feet beneath where they stood talking. Dr. Abraham Yoder presented a more complex challenge. Unlike Klein, Yoder was educated, observant, and possessed of genuine intellectual curiosity. Crowley approached this relationship differently. He engaged Yoder's mind rather than his sentiment. They began meeting for chess on Tuesday evenings in 1843. The games took place at Yoder's home over brandy and often extended late into the night. They discussed medical advances, natural philosophy, the new daguerreotype photography, the expanding railroad networks. Crowley revealed himself to be remarkably well-read, able to converse knowledgeably on topics ranging from Galen's medical theories to the latest political developments in Europe. Yoder came to regard Crowley as the only true intellectual peer in Ashwood Hollow. This friendship created a crucial blind spot. When Yoder occasionally noted odd things, a person falling ill with symptoms that didn't quite make sense, someone claiming to have seen a stranger near Crowley's property who then couldn't be found, he dismissed these anomalies. His rational mind, trained in evidence and observation, couldn't reconcile the educated, thoughtful man he played chess with every Tuesday with anything sinister. In 1847, Yoder's youngest daughter fell seriously ill with scarlet fever. For 3 days, she balanced on the edge of death while Yoder frantically tried every treatment he knew. On the 3rd night, Isaac Crowley appeared at the door with a tonic he claimed his own mother had used during an outbreak in Lancaster years before. The formula was legitimate. Crowley had acquired it from a medical text, and it helped. The girl recovered. After that, Yoder would have defended Crowley against any accusation. The man who saved his daughter could not possibly be a monster. Mayor Hugh Donovan's relationship with Crowley was more transactional but equally important. Donovan was a businessman first, a civic leader second. Crowley became one of his best customers, purchasing supplies regularly, always paying in coin, never on credit. In a town where most people ran tabs they settled quarterly or seasonally, a customer with ready money was to be protected and pleased. Crowley also served as an unofficial consultant on town development. When investors from Philadelphia began showing interest in expanding Ashwood Hollow's coal operations in the late 1850s, Crowley provided valuable input on infrastructure needs, equipment specifications, and labor requirements. His intelligence and education made him useful to Donovan's ambitions for the town. In return, Donovan ensured that certain questions never gained traction. When concerns were raised about vagrants disappearing from the area, Donovan would note that vagrants were, by definition, wanderers. When someone suggested that the number of people passing through Ashwood Hollow who never seemed to pass back out was unusual, Donovan would point to the dangerous terrain, the deep forests, the old abandoned mine shafts where a man could fall and never be found. He was unknowingly providing cover for a serial killer. The early warning signs were there for anyone who cared to piece them together, but they appeared in isolation, separated by months or years, never forming a coherent pattern. In the winter of 1843, a traveling tinker named Samuel Oakes stopped in Ashwood Hollow to ply his trade. He was seen speaking with Isaac Crowley outside the forge on a Tuesday afternoon. By Thursday, Oakes had vanished, leaving his wagon and goods behind at the boarding house where he'd taken a room. The general assumption was that he'd gotten drunk and fallen into Blackwater Creek, which was swollen with snowmelt. His body would turn up downstream, people reasoned. It never did. In 1846, a young woman named Margaret Schieffer, 18 years old and pregnant out of wedlock, disappeared the same week she'd been seen crying outside Crowley's forge. She had reportedly gone to commission a locket as a gift for the baby's father, who had abandoned her. Her family assumed she'd fled in shame, perhaps to Philadelphia or New York, where a girl could disappear into the anonymous crowds. They were half right, she had disappeared. In 1851, an Irish laborer named Finn O'Malley, known as a troublemaker and heavy drinker, got into a dispute with one of the mine owners over wages. He was seen around town for 3 days, drunk and belligerent, swearing he'd get justice. Then he vanished. No one was particularly surprised or concerned. Men like O'Malley drifted like leaves on the wind. In 1855, a former soldier named Jacob Went, who had returned from the Mexican War with what Dr. Yoder termed melancholia, and what we might recognize as severe post-traumatic stress, wandered away from his family's farm. He'd been erratic, prone to fits of despair and rage. His disappearance was considered tragic but not mysterious. Men in his condition sometimes took their own lives in the wilderness. None of these disappearances were connected. Why would they be? They involved different types of people over different years. There was no pattern visible from the inside, no common thread except the one no one suspected. Each person had visited Isaac Crowley's forge shortly before vanishing. And each person fit Crowley's selection criteria perfectly. People whose absence would be noted but not thoroughly investigated. People without powerful family connections. People who might plausibly have moved on, met with an accident, or chosen to disappear. Crowley's misdirection extended to his property itself. He maintained the grounds meticulously, creating an atmosphere of openness and order. Neighbors were welcome to visit the forge during business hours. Children would sometimes watch him work, fascinated by the fire and the ringing hammer. He would show them how iron bent to heat and force, explain the chemistry of the forge, let them pump the bellows under careful supervision. A man who welcomed children into his workspace could not be hiding something terrible in that same workspace. This was the unconscious reasoning that protected Crowley for decades. At night, after the forge closed, the property transformed. Crowley would bank the coals, bid goodnight to any lingering customers, and lock the heavy doors. Once alone, he would shift the massive iron plate that covered his secret entrance, descend the stone steps he'd carved into the earth, and enter his underground kingdom. There, by lamplight, he would check his shackles, observe his victims, and indulge in whatever dark compulsions drove him. The stone walls were thick enough that screams became whispers before reaching the surface. The ventilation shaft was designed with baffles that dispersed sound. A person could cry out in agony in that chamber and not be heard 20 feet away above ground. By 1860, Isaac Crowley had lived in Ashwood Hollow for 19 years. He was 50 years old, a pillar of the community, respected by everyone from the minister to the mayor to the sheriff. His forge was considered the finest in 3 counties. His reputation was unblemished. And beneath his property, chained in darkness, at least 7 people had already died in torment. The horror was operating at peak efficiency, invisible and unsuspected. It might have continued indefinitely, might have claimed dozens more victims over the years, might never have been discovered at all. But in September of 1860, Isaac Crowley made his first significant mistake. He took someone people would actually miss. Her name was Eleanor Pritchard, and she was the 16-year-old niece of Mayor Hugh Donovan. Eleanor had come to Ashwood Hollow in the summer of 1860 to help her aunt through a difficult pregnancy. She was a bright, cheerful girl from Harrisburg, educated beyond what was typical for women of her class, and well-liked by everyone she met. She had auburn hair that caught the sunlight, a quick laugh, and ambitions to become a teacher. On September 14, 1860, Eleanor left the Donovan house at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, telling her aunt she was going to the general store to purchase embroidery thread. She was seen entering the store by multiple witnesses. She purchased the thread along with 2 pieces of peppermint candy. She left the store at approximately 2:30. At 2:45, Mrs. Catherine Brenner, the same widow who had first leased property to Isaac Crowley, saw Eleanor walking east along Mill Road in the direction of Crowley's forge. Mrs. Brenner waved to her. Eleanor waved back. Eleanor Pritchard was never seen alive again. When she failed to return by supper time, her aunt grew concerned but not alarmed. By 8 o'clock, concern became worry. By 10 o'clock, Mayor Donovan had roused Sheriff Klein and organized a search party of 20 men carrying torches and lanterns. They searched through the night and into the next day. They found no trace of her. No body in the creek, no torn clothing caught on branches, no signs of a struggle anywhere along the routes she might have walked. A 16-year-old girl had simply vanished in broad daylight from a town of 600 people. This was not a vagrant or a troubled soldier or an unwed mother. This was the mayor's niece, a respectable girl from a good family in the state capital. Her disappearance could not be dismissed or explained away. Her father, Robert Pritchard, arrived from Harrisburg 3 days later with a private investigator named Thomas Brennan. Pritchard was a wealthy merchant with political connections, and he made it clear he would not rest until his daughter was found. He offered a reward of $500, an enormous sum, for information leading to her discovery. The investigation began in earnest. Thomas Brennan was a former Pinkerton agent, experienced and thorough. He interviewed everyone who had seen Eleanor that day, mapping her movements with precision. He established that she had been walking toward the eastern edge of town when last seen. He noted that Isaac Crowley's forge was located on that eastern edge. On September 19th, Brennan and Sheriff Klein visited the forge. Crowley was gracious and concerned. Yes, he had seen Eleanor Pritchard pass by that afternoon. He'd been working outside, repairing a wagon wheel for the Schneider family. She had waved to him, and he had waved back. He estimated the time at around 3 o'clock. She had continued walking east past his property toward the trail that led to the old Hammond farm. "Did she seem distressed?" Brennan asked. "Not at all," Crowley replied. "She seemed quite cheerful. It's a terrible thing, her disappearance. I've been praying for her safe return." Brennan asked to search the property. Crowley consented immediately. "Of course, search anywhere you like. I only wish I could be of more help." They searched the forge, the house, the grounds. They found nothing suspicious. Crowley even showed them through his workshop, explaining various projects in progress, demonstrating the mechanisms of his forge. He was the picture of cooperative concern. What Brennan noted in his private journal that evening was this: subject too cooperative, too calm, something is wrong but cannot identify what. The search for Alina continued for 2 weeks. Every barn, every root cellar, every abandoned structure within 5 miles was examined. The forests were combed by teams of volunteers. Dr. Yoder examined the creek banks for any sign of a body. Nothing. Robert Pritchard increased the reward to $1,000. He brought pressure on the county sheriff, on the state authorities, demanding answers. But there were no answers to give. Alina Pritchard had vanished as if she'd never existed. She was, at that moment, shackled in the darkness 30 feet beneath Isaac Crowley's forge. Barely conscious from laudanum Crowley had forced down her throat, her wrists already raw from the iron cuffs. The first mistake Crowley made was in taking someone important. The second mistake came 3 weeks later, when a witness emerged who had seen something that didn't fit Crowley's timeline. A boy named Thomas Mayer, 13 years old, son of the tavern keeper, came forward hesitantly. He'd been afraid to speak earlier because he'd been somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, fishing at a spot beyond Crowley's property where the creek formed a deep pool. He knew the land was private, knew he could get in trouble, but his conscience finally overcame his fear. Thomas told Sheriff Klein that on the afternoon Alina disappeared, he'd been at his fishing spot from about 2:30 until nearly 4 o'clock. To reach that spot, he had to pass within sight of Crowley's forge, though he'd stayed hidden in the tree line to avoid being seen and chased off. He had seen Alina Pritchard walking past the forge at around 3 o'clock, just as Crowley had said. But Thomas's account differed in one crucial detail. Alina hadn't continued past the forge heading east. She had stopped. Crowley had come out to speak with her. They had talked for several minutes. Thomas couldn't hear what was said, and then Alina had followed Crowley inside the forge. "Are you certain?" Klein asked. "Absolutely certain she went inside." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "I remember because I thought it was odd. A young lady going into a blacksmith's shop alone, but I figured maybe she had something to have fixed. I didn't think much of it at the time." "Did you see her come out?" "No, sir, I was watching my line. When I looked back maybe 10-15 minutes later, I didn't see anyone. I figured she'd left while I wasn't paying attention." Sheriff Klein felt something cold settle in his stomach. Isaac Crowley had said Alina walked past his forge. He had specifically said she continued east. He had not mentioned her stopping, had not mentioned her entering the forge. Why would Crowley lie about such a detail? Klein struggled with what to do. Isaac Crowley was his friend. They'd known each other for nearly 20 years. The man had repaired Klein's daughter's music box just last month, refusing payment, saying it was his pleasure to help. Could such a man be capable of? What was Klein even suggesting? He decided to consult Dr. Yoder before taking any action. Abraham Yoder listened to Klein's concerns with growing unease. The doctor's rational mind wanted to dismiss the discrepancy. A 13-year-old boy's memory against the word of a respected man. Surely the boy was confused about the timing, or perhaps Alina had stopped briefly, and Crowley had forgotten to mention it. But Yoder was a man of science, trained to recognize patterns and anomalies. And once Klein's suspicions had been voiced, other anomalies began surfacing in Yoder's memory. There was the matter of the medications. Over the years, Crowley had occasionally purchased laudanum from Yoder, always with reasonable explanations. Tooth pain, an old injury that troubled him in winter, difficulty sleeping. Taken individually, each purchase was unremarkable. But now, reviewing his records, Yoder realized that Crowley had purchased laudanum at least 20 times over the past 15 years. far more than seemed necessary for a man who appeared to be in good health. There was also something Yoder had observed but never quite processed. 3 times over the years, he had made house calls to Crowley's property for minor ailments: a persistent cough, a badly bruised hand, a fever. Each time, Crowley had met him outside and walked him to the house, steering him along a specific path. Yoder had never been allowed to simply walk to the door on his own. At the time, it had seemed like mere politeness, Crowley acting as a proper host. Now, Yoder wondered if Crowley had been ensuring that the doctor didn't wander near certain parts of the property. And there was one more thing, something Yoder had witnessed in 1851 that he'd dismissed at the time. Late one evening in October of that year, Yoder had been returning from a difficult childbirth at a farm north of town. His route took him past Crowley's property around midnight. He had seen lamplight in the forge, which was unusual but not unheard of. Blacksmiths sometimes worked late to complete urgent orders. But then he'd seen Crowley emerge from the forge carrying something. Even at a distance, even in the dim moonlight, Yoder could see it was a bundle of cloth or canvas, roughly the size and shape of a person. Crowley had carried it to a wagon, loaded it, and driven off toward the east. Yoder had thought nothing of it at the time. Crowley was probably moving supplies or delivering a completed commission or any number of ordinary explanations. But now, years later, with Klein's suspicions fresh in his mind, the memory took on a sinister cast. What if it hadn't been canvas? What if it had been a body? "We need to search his property again," Yoder said slowly. "More thoroughly this time." "He'll consent," Klein said. "He did before." "Then he'll have to consent again," Yoder replied. "And this time we look everywhere. We tear up floorboards if we have to." But both men hesitated. They were contemplating accusing a pillar of the community based on a boy's testimony and a collection of vague suspicions. If they were wrong, the scandal would destroy them. Crowley was well-liked, well-connected. Mayor Donovan considered him a friend. Reverend Blackwell praised him from the pulpit. The decision was taken out of their hands 2 days later when the third incident occurred. On the morning of October 10th, 1860, a farmer named Ernst Mueller was checking his property line fence about a quarter-mile from Crowley's forge when his dog began barking frantically at what appeared to be a drainage culvert running down the hillside. The dog wouldn't leave the spot, kept digging at the ground around the culvert opening, whining and barking. Mueller investigated. The culvert appeared to be a simple drainage pipe, the kind used to prevent water from pooling. But the opening was larger than necessary for drainage, and when Mueller peered inside, he saw that it extended much farther than he would have expected. He also smelled something. Not the smell of stagnant water or dead animals, but something else. Something human, the smell of unwashed bodies and human waste. Mueller put his ear to the opening. And from somewhere far below, from somewhere deep in the earth, he heard something that made his blood freeze. He heard someone crying. It was faint, barely audible, more a vibration in the air than a clear sound. But it was unmistakably human. A voice, weak and desperate, echoing up through the shaft. Mueller ran for town. Within an hour, Sheriff Klein, Dr. Yoder, Thomas Brennan, and a group of 10 men were at the culvert. They listened. For the first few minutes, they heard nothing. Then it came again, that faint, desperate sound. Someone was alive down there. They traced the culvert to its source. The opening emerged from a hillside approximately 120 yards from Isaac Crowley's forge. The direction suggested the shaft ran directly toward Crowley's property. Thomas Brennan looked at Sheriff Klein. "Get shovels," he said quietly, "and get men you trust absolutely. We're going to dig." "Shouldn't we talk to Crowley first?" Klein asked, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Brennan said flatly. "If there's something down there, if someone is alive down there, we don't warn him, we dig first. We will ask questions later." They dug, The ground was hard, dense with clay and rock, but they dug with the desperate energy of men who feared what they might find but feared more what might happen if they delayed. They followed the culvert down, widening it, reinforcing the sides with timber as they went. 2 feet down, then 3, then 4. The air grew closer, damper. The smell became stronger, definitely human waste, unwashed flesh, something rotten. At 6 feet down, the culvert joined a larger shaft, carefully constructed of mortared stone. This was no natural formation, no simple drainage system. This was deliberate architecture, hidden underground. They heard the crying again, louder now, a woman's voice, weak and hoarse, calling out words they couldn't distinguish. "Eleanor," Dr. Yoder shouted into the darkness. "Eleanor Pritchard, can you hear me?" The crying stopped abruptly. Then faint but unmistakable, "Help me, please, please help me." It was her voice. After 4 weeks missing, Eleanor Pritchard was alive. The men dug with renewed urgency. They widened the shaft enough for a man to descend on rope. Thomas Brennan volunteered. They lowered him into darkness with a lantern. What Brennan saw in the light of that lantern would haunt him for the rest of his life. The shaft opened into a chamber of carefully mortared stone. Iron rings studded the walls. Shackles hung from those rings, and chained to one of those rings, filthy and emaciated, her dress torn and fouled, her wrists bloody from the iron cuffs, was Eleanor Pritchard. She was alone in the chamber. But the chamber had been designed to hold many more. Brennan counted the rings as he rushed to Eleanor, 23 of them, and from several the shackles hung open and empty, but the stone beneath them was stained dark with what could only be old blood. "Get her out," he shouted up the shaft. "And send for the sheriff, send for everyone. There's a goddamned prison down here." They brought Eleanor up carefully, wrapping her in blankets, Dr. Yoder immediately beginning to examine her. She was severely dehydrated, malnourished, her wrists infected from the shackles. But she was alive, and she could speak. "Isaac Crowley," she whispered. "He took me. He put something over my face, something that made me sleep. When I woke up, I was chained. He kept me in the dark. He would come. He would come and just watch me. Sometimes he would talk, but not to me, to himself, about the others. About all the others he'd kept there." "Others?" Yoder asked gently. "Eleanor, were there others down there with you?" "No," she said. "I was alone, but he talked about them, about how long each one lasted. About how they screamed at first but went quiet eventually. About how he was perfecting his methods." Sheriff Klein stood at the edge of the excavation, his face ashen. 20 years. He had known Isaac Crowley for 20 years. Had called him friend, had trusted him. "Where is Crowley now?" Brennan asked. "At his forge, I assume," Klein said quietly. "Where he's been this whole time, 300 yards from where he kept that girl chained in the dark." "Then I suggest," Brennan said, his voice hard as the iron Crowley had worked, "that we pay Mr. Crowley a visit. Right now, before word spreads and he has a chance to run." They came down the hill toward the forge in a group, Klein, Brennan, Yoder, and 8 armed men. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Smoke rose from the forge chimney. The sound of a hammer on anvil rang out across the clear October air. Isaac Crowley was working as if it were any ordinary day. He looked up as they approached, smiled his usual slight smile, and set down his hammer. "Gentlemen," he said, "what can I do for you?" "Isaac Crowley," Sheriff Klein said, his voice shaking despite his effort to control it. "You're under arrest for the kidnapping of Eleanor Pritchard. And for suspected murder." Crowley's expression didn't change. He looked at each man in turn, his dark eyes showing neither surprise nor fear. Then he did something that chilled them all. He smiled. "I wondered," he said calmly, "how long it would take. 20 years is longer than I expected, honestly. I was beginning to think you might never find out. If this is giving you chills, if you felt your stomach drop when Isaac Crowley smiled and admitted what he'd done, then you understand why this story was buried for so long. Why were the records sealed? Why the people of Ashwood Hollow wanted to forget. but we're not going to let them forget. We're going to uncover every horrifying detail of what happened in that underground chamber. I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who can handle the truth. Someone brave enough to face the darkest corners of human nature. Because what we're about to reveal, what Isaac Crowley confessed to in the hours after his arrest, is beyond anything you've heard so far. We're talking about a systematic operation that lasted 3 decades. We're talking about a man who perfected the art of torture and imprisonment. We're talking about victims who suffered for weeks, months, some possibly even years, while the world above went about its normal business. The investigators thought finding Alina Pritchard alive was the end of the nightmare. They had no idea it was only the beginning. Let's discover together what happens next, what they found when they truly searched Isaac Crowley's property, when they excavated that chamber completely, when they examined every dark corner of his forge. Because those 11 missing sets of shackles, we're about to find out exactly who wore them. Isaac Crowley was placed in shackles, bitter irony not lost on anyone present, and taken to the small jail behind Sheriff Klein's office. He went peacefully, almost cheerfully, making conversation about the weather as if he were being escorted to a Sunday social rather than a cell. "You'll want to search thoroughly," he told Brennan as they locked him in. "I've been quite meticulous in my record-keeping. You'll find everything you need in the forge, behind the loose stone in the northeast corner, 3rd row from the floor. I assume you'll want to know exactly what happened." "I'd be happy to explain my methods." His casual demeanor was almost more disturbing than resistance would have been. Thomas Brennan assembled a team of 12 men for the search. Dr. Yoder joined them, as did the county coroner who had been summoned from Hazleton. They began at dawn on October 11th, 1860, with the underground chamber. The complete excavation and documentation took 6 days. What they found would require 17 boxes to contain all the evidence and documentation. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering and a monument to depravity. 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, with a ceiling height of approximately 8 feet. Every surface was carefully mortared stone. The floor was sloped slightly toward a central drainage channel that ran the length of the room and emptied into an underground stream, a design that allowed Crowley to wash away blood and waste. 23 iron rings were set into the walls, arranged in a grid pattern. Each ring was forged from high-quality iron, designed to support substantial weight and stress. The shackles that hung from them were equally well crafted. Crowley's professional pride extended even to the instruments of his victims' suffering. But these were not simple restraints. Each set of shackles included modifications that revealed Crowley's systematic approach. The wrist cuffs were lined with a thin layer of leather, not for comfort, but to prevent the victim from dying too quickly from infected wounds. The chains were of varying lengths, apparently adjusted based on the height of each victim to keep them in specific positions. Some chains allowed the victim to sit or crouch but not lie down. Others permitted only standing. The torture was in the precision. In one corner of the chamber they found what Dr. Yoder identified as a working area, a wooden table, badly stained, with leather straps attached to each corner. Nearby were tools. Knives of various sizes, all meticulously maintained and sharp, pliers, a small brazier for heating iron implements, needles and thread of the type used for suturing wounds. This last detail was particularly chilling. Crowley had medical supplies. He had kept his victims alive, had treated their wounds to prevent fatal infections, had extended their suffering as long as possible. On a shelf carved into the stone wall, they found 10 glass bottles containing laudanum, chloroform, and other chemicals. Crowley had used these to subdue his victims initially, and, the investigators theorized, to occasionally render them unconscious when he needed to transport them, or when their screaming became too persistent. The ventilation shaft that Mueller's dog had discovered was just one of three. Crowley had engineered the chamber to provide adequate air circulation, enough to keep victims alive indefinitely, but designed with baffles that dispersed and muffled sound. A person could scream themselves hoarse in that chamber and sound like a whisper on the surface. Against one wall, they found a locked cabinet. When they broke it open, they discovered Crowley's records. He had kept journals. 4 of them leather-bound, filled with neat, precise handwriting. The entries were dated, organized, and clinical in their detail. They read like scientific observations, devoid of emotion or moral consideration. The first entry was dated November 3, 1841. Subject 1 acquired this evening. Male, approximately 35 years, vagrant class. Applied chloroform-soaked cloth at 8:47 p.m. Subject unconscious within 2 minutes. Transport to the chamber completed without incident. Subject secured to position 7 western wall, 3rd from north. Regained consciousness at approximately 10:15 p.m. Initial reaction: confusion followed by fear followed by anger. Verbal threats for approximately 1 hour, then quiet. Will observe development over coming days. The entries continued with horrifying regularity. Crowley documented everything. How long each victim survived, how they reacted to captivity, how their behavior changed over time, what methods of torture produced which results, how much food and water was required to keep them alive but suffering. He had numbered his victims, Subject 1 through Subject 19, 19 people over the course of 32 years. Eleanor Pritchard had been Subject 19. The journals revealed that Crowley's intervals between acquisitions had varied. Sometimes years would pass between victims. Other times he took multiple subjects within months of each other. The pattern seemed tied to opportunity and risk rather than compulsion. He was patient, methodical, never acting impulsively. From the journals, investigators were able to construct a timeline of horror. Subject 1, 1841, survived 47 days, male vagrant. Subject 2, 1843, survived 63 days. The traveling tinker, Samuel Oakes. Subject 3, 1846, survived 89 days, Margaret Schieffer, the pregnant girl. Subject 4, 1848, survived 34 days, an unnamed drifter. Subject 5, 1851, survived 127 days, Finn O'Malley, the Irish laborer. Crowley noted that O'Malley had been remarkably resilient and provided extensive opportunity for study. The entries went on, each one documenting a life stolen, prolonged suffering inflicted. Death finally arriving not as mercy, but as the inevitable conclusion of Crowley's experiments. What became clear from the journals was that Crowley viewed his captives not as people, but as specimens. He was conducting what he perceived as research into human endurance, pain tolerance, psychological breakdown, and the physical limits of survival under sustained stress. One entry from 1854 was particularly revealing. Subject 11 has now been in position for 93 days. Notable deterioration in mental faculties observed. The subject no longer responds to verbal stimuli. Physical condition: severe muscle atrophy, multiple pressure sores, treated to prevent systemic infection, estimated weight loss of 45 to 50 pounds. The question that drives this study persists. At what point does the human animal abandon hope entirely? Subject 11 appears to have reached this threshold. The eyes show no recognition, no fear, no desire. This is the state I seek to document, the precise moment when personhood ceases but biological function continues. Dr. Yoder had to excuse himself from the examination room after reading that entry. He vomited in the alley behind the sheriff's office. then sat with his head in his hands for 20 minutes before he could continue. The journals also contained sketches. Crowley had drawn detailed diagrams of his chamber, the placement of the iron rings, modifications to his shackle designs, anatomical studies of restraint injuries. There were also sketches of faces, his victims' faces, rendered with disturbing skill, showing the progression of their deterioration over time. One sketch was labeled Subject 7, Day 1, and showed a young woman's face, frightened but defiant. The next page showed Subject 7, Day 56, the same face, hollow-eyed, sunken-cheeked, all defiance gone, replaced by blank despair. Beyond the journals, they found what Crowley had called his acquisition notes, smaller notebooks where he had tracked potential victims. He had observed people, documented their routines, assessed the risk of their disappearance being thoroughly investigated. He had stalked them, sometimes for months, before deciding whether to act. In these notes, they found references to at least a dozen people Crowley had considered taking but ultimately decided against because the risk was too high. Families in Ashwood Hollow would later read these notes and realize with horror that their loved ones had been watched, studied, evaluated as potential victims, spared only by Crowley's calculating risk assessment. The physical evidence in the chamber corroborated the journals. The investigators found human remains in various states of decay. The 12 skeletons that would be discovered by railroad workers in 1875 were not in the chamber during this 1860 search. Crowley had already relocated them to what he called his archive, the secondary burial site on the southern part of his property. But they found other evidence of death, blood stains that no amount of washing had completely removed. Fingernail scratches on the stone walls, some still containing fragments of nail and dried blood. Strands of hair, pieces of torn clothing, a woman's shoe, a man's belt buckle. In the drainage channel, they found teeth. 11 human teeth, apparently knocked out during beatings or lost through malnutrition and disease. Dr. Yoder collected them carefully, his hands shaking, wondering whose mouths they had come from. The investigators also found what appeared to be tally marks scratched into the stone near several of the iron rings. Victims had been marking days, tracking time, maintaining some fragment of hope that they might eventually be released. The longest sequence of marks they found numbered 134. Someone had been chained in that darkness for at least 4.5 months, aware enough to track each passing day. When they confronted Crowley with the evidence, asked him to explain himself, he was forthcoming, disturbingly so. "I wanted to understand," he said simply, sitting in his cell, his hands folded calmly in his lap. "Human suffering is universal, but it's rarely studied systematically. Pain is applied haphazardly, in punishment, in torture for information, in war. But what could we learn if suffering was applied methodically, documented, analyzed? What are the true limits of human endurance? At what point does hope expire? When does the mind break completely? These are questions that cannot be answered through casual observation." "You tortured innocent people," Brennan said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I conducted research," Crowley corrected. "And I was careful to select subjects whose absence would not disrupt society. Vagrants, drifters, persons of loose morals, the mentally disturbed. People who were already, in essence, peripheral to the functioning community." Elena Pritchard was a 16-year-old girl from a good family. For the first time, Crowley showed something like regret. "Yes, that was an error in judgment. I saw her walking alone, and the opportunity seemed too perfect. I acted impulsively, which was foolish. Had I maintained my usual standards of selection, I likely could have continued my work indefinitely." "Your work," Dr. Yoder said, unable to keep the disgust from his voice. "You call this work? What else would you call systematic observation and documentation?" Crowley asked, genuinely seeming puzzled. I maintained detailed records, I controlled variables, I tested hypotheses. Is that not the scientific method? It became clear during these interrogations that Isaac Crowley lacked something fundamental in his psychology. He understood intellectually that society condemned what he had done, but he showed no emotional comprehension of his victims' suffering. They were objects to him, no more worthy of empathy than the iron he bent in his forge. The interrogations revealed additional details that hadn't been clear from the journals. Crowley explained his selection process, his methods of subduing victims, his techniques for keeping them alive as long as possible. He described his system for disposing of bodies. Some he buried on his property, others he weighted with scrap iron and sank in deep pools along Blackwater Creek. Others he transported to abandoned mine shafts miles from town. The chamber was designed to hold 23 subjects simultaneously, he explained. That was my ultimate goal, to have a full complement, to be able to compare different subjects' responses to identical conditions. I never achieved that goal. The most I held at one time was 4 back in 1857, but they died within weeks of each other. A fever spread among them. After that, I maintained smaller numbers, usually 1 or 2 at a time. Quality over quantity. The investigators asked about specific victims, reading names from the list of missing persons they'd compiled. Crowley confirmed most of them, corrected a few assumptions, added names they hadn't known were victims. The soldier Jacob Went, Crowley said. He was subject 14, lasted only 34 days. The melancholia had already weakened him. He barely fought at all. Disappointing, actually. I had hoped his military training would make him more resistant to psychological breakdown, but the opposite proved true. When they asked about the longest surviving victim, Crowley became almost animated. Subject 16. A woman named Ruth Holloway, though I doubt you have her on your list. She was passing through in 1858, a widow traveling west. No family looking for her, no connections to anyone local. She survived 147 days. Remarkable constitution. She maintained hope far longer than any other subject. Even at the end, she was still praying aloud. I documented her prayers. They evolved over time, from prayers for rescue to prayers for strength to prayers for death. Fascinating progression. Thomas Brennan had to leave the room before he did something that would compromise the investigation. The scope of Crowley's operation became clearer as they compiled all the evidence. 19 confirmed victims over 32 years, though Crowley hinted there might have been others early on, before he began keeping detailed records. The youngest victim was 16, Eleanor Pritchard, who survived. The oldest was approximately 55, a vagrant Crowley identified as Subject 9. 8 victims were women, 11 were men. Most were between 20 and 40 years old, young enough to be resilient, old enough to have lost the protection of family oversight. All fit Crowley's criteria of being forgettable, people whose disappearance could be explained away. The torture was psychological as much as physical. Crowley rarely beat his victims. He found that counterproductive. Instead, he used isolation, darkness, restraint, and time. He would visit the chamber once daily, sometimes bringing food and water, sometimes not. Sometimes he would speak to his victims, conversational and polite, asking how they felt, whether they maintained hope, what they dreamed about. Other times he would simply stand and watch them in silence for hours. He was breaking them systematically, documenting the process of human psychological destruction. The most disturbing element, the detail that haunted the investigators more than any other, was revealed in the final journal entry, dated October 9, 1860, the day before Eleanor was discovered. Subject 19 has been in position for 26 days. The error in her acquisition troubles me. I have decided to terminate this study and relocate. The risk has become unacceptable. Subject 19 will be processed tomorrow evening, and I will begin dismantling the chamber. It has served its purpose for 3 decades. Perhaps in another location, with greater isolation, I can resume the work. The question of human suffering's ultimate boundaries remains unanswered. I will need more time, more subjects, and better controls. This has been merely preliminary research. The true study is yet to come. Processed was Crowley's euphemism for murder. If Mueller's dog hadn't found that ventilation shaft when it did, if the search had been delayed even 24 hours, Elena Pritchard would have died. Crowley would have disposed of her body, dismantled his chamber, and disappeared. He might have set up another forge in another isolated town and begun again. The horror wasn't just what he had done. It was that he had fully intended to continue. The discovery of Isaac Crowley's chamber and the rescue of Elena Pritchard should have united Ashwood Hollow in horror and righteous anger. Instead, it fractured the community along fault lines of denial, complicity, and self-preservation. The problem was simple. For 32 years, Isaac Crowley had lived among them as a trusted neighbor. He had repaired their tools, shod their horses, attended their church. Many had considered him a friend. To accept the full truth of what he had done meant accepting that they had all been deceived, that evil had operated openly in their midst while they smiled and waved and wished him good morning. Some people cannot bear that weight of realization. They choose denial instead. Within a week of Crowley's arrest, a faction emerged led by Reverend Thomas Blackwell and supported by several prominent citizens. They didn't deny that Crowley had taken Elena Pritchard. The evidence was irrefutable. But they questioned the scope of the accusations. 19 victims? Wasn't that excessive? Might the investigators be exaggerating, seeing patterns where none existed? We must be cautious, Blackwell preached the Sunday after Crowley's arrest, not to condemn a man beyond what the evidence truly supports. Isaac Crowley has committed a terrible sin in taking the Pritchard girl, yes, but let us not allow hysteria to transform one crime into a catalog of imagined horrors. Dr. Yoder, sitting in the congregation, felt his blood turn cold. He stood up in the middle of the sermon. "Imagined," he said, his voice shaking. "I have read his journals, Reverend. I have seen the chamber. I have examined Elena Pritchard's injuries. There is nothing imagined about what that man did." "Dr. Yoder, please," Blackwell said. "This is neither the time nor the place." "Then when is the time?" Yoder demanded. "When is the appropriate moment to face the truth? That man kept human beings chained in darkness for months. He documented their suffering like a scientist documenting specimens. He has confessed to 19 victims, and you stand there suggesting we're exaggerating." The congregation erupted in argument. Some supported Yoder. Others, uncomfortable with the implications, sided with Blackwell's call for caution. The service ended in chaos. This division would characterize Ashwood Hollow for years to come. The resistance to the investigation took more sinister forms as well. Thomas Brennan began receiving anonymous threats. Notes slipped under his door at the boarding house warned him to stop digging and leave town while you can. One night, someone threw a rock through his window with a message tied to it. Some truths are better buried. Sheriff Klein faced similar pressure, though more direct. Mayor Donovan called him into his office 3 days after the arrest. "This investigation is destroying the town," Donovan said. "Property values are plummeting. The coal investors from Philadelphia are reconsidering their plans. People are talking about leaving. You need to wrap this up quickly and quietly." "Wrap it up," Klein said, incredulous. "Hugh, there are bodies still unaccounted for." Crowley mentioned burial sites. "One crime, one conviction," Donovan interrupted. "He kidnapped Elena Pritchard. He's going to hang for it. That's justice. The rest, these allegations about other victims from years or decades ago, it's unprovable. It's destructive. Let it go. Klein realized with sick certainty that the mayor cared more about Ashwood Hollow's reputation than about the victims Crowley had murdered. No, Klein said quietly. I won't let it go. Those people deserve to be found. Their families deserve to know what happened to them. Then you're a fool, Donovan said coldly. And you're relieved of duty, effective immediately. The mayor had that authority under the town charter. Klein turned in his badge that afternoon, but he didn't stop investigating. If anything, being freed from official constraints made him more determined. He joined forces with Brennan and Yoder to continue the work privately, funded by Robert Pritchard, who had stayed in Ashwood Hollow and who possessed both the money and the connections to see the investigation through despite local resistance. Their first priority was locating the burial sites Crowley had mentioned. The blacksmith had been cooperative to a point, but he seemed to take perverse pleasure in making the investigators work for information. He provided hints rather than direct answers, treating the whole proceeding as a game. The South Pasture holds some answers, he told them. But you'll need to dig deep. I was quite thorough in my burials. 6 feet minimum, often 8 or 10. Can't have animals disturbing the graves after all. The South Pasture was 15 acres of land Crowley had purchased in 1847, ostensibly for future expansion of his business. It had remained undeveloped, overgrown with grass and wildflowers, appearing entirely innocent. Brennan organized a systematic search. They brought in 2 surveying engineers from Hazleton and divided the pasture into a grid. Then they began probing the ground with iron rods, searching for the disturbed soil that would indicate a grave. It took 3 weeks of painstaking work. The town watched with a mixture of morbid fascination and resentful anxiety. Some came to observe the search. Others protested it, arguing that the investigators were disturbing the peace, creating scandal, destroying the town's good name. On November 2nd, 1860, the searchers found the first grave. 8 feet down, wrapped in canvas that had partially rotted away, they found skeletal remains. The skeleton showed the same characteristic marks on the wrist and ankle bones, deep grooves from prolonged shackling. Over the next month, they found 11 more graves, 12 bodies total, matching the 12 sets of shackles that had hung empty in the chamber. Crowley had buried his victims in his own field, had walked over their graves for years, had probably looked out his window at the pasture and felt satisfaction at his secret cemetery. Dr. Yoder and the county coroner examined each set of remains. The condition of the bones, the depth of the graves, and the decay of the canvas wrappings suggested the burials had occurred over an extended period, consistent with Crowley's timeline. They could determine approximate age and sex for most of the victims, though individual identification proved difficult. However, some victims could be identified through artifacts buried with them. One skeleton, a young woman, had been buried with a locket containing a miniature portrait. Mrs. Catherine Brenner, when shown the locket, broke down sobbing. She recognized it immediately. It was the locket Margaret Schieffer had been seen wearing the week before she disappeared in 1846. I gave that to her, Mrs. Brenner wept. She helped me through a terrible illness that winter. I gave her that locket as thanks and told her to sell it if she ever needed money, and that monster buried it with her body. Buried it where no one would ever find it. Another skeleton, male, was buried with a distinctive pocket watch. The initials F.O. were engraved on the case. Finn O'Malley's brother, who had searched for him for months after his disappearance in 1851, identified it as Finn's watch, inherited from their father. These identifications transformed abstractions into reality. These weren't just Subject 3 and Subject 5 from Crowley's journals. They were Margaret Schieffer, who liked to sing while she worked and who had been kind to a sick old woman. They were Finn O'Malley, who had been loud and difficult but who had a brother who loved him and who had never stopped searching. Each identification broke another family's heart while finally providing the terrible closure of certainty. But 12 bodies accounted for only 12 of the 19 victims. Where were the other 7? Crowley had mentioned disposing of bodies in deep pools along Blackwater Creek and in abandoned mine shafts. The investigators began the grim work of dragging the creek and exploring the old shafts that dotted the area from previous failed mining operations. The creek yielded nothing. Either the bodies had been carried downstream during floods or Crowley had lied about using this method. The mine shafts were more productive and more dangerous. Many were unstable, at risk of collapse. Brennan hired professional miners from one of the working coal operations to safely explore the abandoned shafts within 5 miles of Ashwood Hollow. In a shaft 2 miles east of town, they found 3 skeletons at the bottom of a 100-foot drop. 2 appeared to be male, 1 female. The condition of the remains and the presence of iron shackles still attached to wrist bones confirmed these were Crowley's victims. He had apparently thrown their bodies into the shaft, letting them fall to the bottom where they would be nearly impossible to retrieve. The miners managed to bring up 2 of the 3 skeletons. The third was pinned under collapsed timber and deemed too dangerous to recover. That brought the count to 15 recovered bodies out of 19 victims. 4 remained missing. Crowley, when pressed, claimed not to remember their disposal. "It was many years ago," he said with a shrug. "I didn't keep records of the disposals, only of the acquisitions and the study period. Once a subject expired, the body was simply waste to be disposed of efficiently." The casual callousness of his words drove home a truth the investigators had come to understand. Isaac Crowley was not insane by any legal or medical definition. He was something potentially more frightening, completely rational, highly intelligent, and utterly devoid of empathy. He understood right and wrong intellectually, but felt no moral imperative to choose right over wrong. Dr. Yoder, trained in the latest medical and psychological theories, attempted to understand Crowley's psychology through interviews. Crowley, seemingly pleased to have an educated audience, spoke freely. "I first understood my difference from others when I was 12 years old," Crowley explained. "A neighbor's child fell into a well. Everyone was distraught, crying, rushing to help. I felt nothing except curiosity about how long the child could survive in the cold water. I understood that my lack of feeling was unusual, so I learned to mimic the appropriate responses. Concern, fear, relief when the child was rescued, but I felt none of it genuinely." "You're describing an absence of conscience," Yoder said. "Conscience is merely learned behavior reinforced by fear of consequences," Crowley replied. "I learned the behaviors but never internalized the fear. My work here was conducted out of pure intellectual curiosity. If society had sanctioned such research, I would have conducted it openly. Since it did not, I conducted it privately." "You tortured innocent people." "I studied suffering. The people themselves were incidental. You dissect corpses to study anatomy. I studied living subjects to understand suffering. The principle is the same." "The principle is not remotely the same," Yoder said, struggling to control his anger. "Those were human beings, not anatomical specimens." "The distinction seems arbitrary to me," Crowley said. "But I understand that society draws it, which is why I am here in this cell. I miscalculated the risk with the Pritchard girl, an error in judgment. If not for that error, I would still be conducting my research." These interviews revealed something that troubled Yoder deeply. Crowley showed no sign of wanting to stop. Given opportunity and freedom, he would continue. The only thing that had ended his research was being caught. As the investigation progressed, another disturbing question emerged. Had Crowley acted entirely alone? Some of the logistics seemed improbable for a single person. Moving unconscious victims to the chamber, managing multiple captives simultaneously, maintaining the elaborate deception for 3 decades. Could one man have done all this without any assistance? Brennan found hints in Crowley's acquisition notes that suggested possible collaboration. One entry from 1852 referenced the delivery from WB, followed by a description of a new victim, Subject 10. Who was WB? Had someone provided Crowley with a victim? Another entry from 1857 mentioned payment rendered to TM for silence regarding October incident. Had Crowley been blackmailing someone who had discovered something? When confronted with these references, Crowley smiled but refused to elaborate. "Some gentlemen prefer their privacy," he said. "I'll not betray confidences." The possibility that others in Ashwood Hollow had known about Crowley's activities, had perhaps even assisted him or accepted payment to remain silent, sent a new wave of paranoia through the community. People began looking at their neighbors with suspicion. Who were WB and TM? What had they known? What had they done? This paranoia was weaponized by those who wanted the investigation to end. They argued that Brennan was tearing the community apart with baseless accusations, that seeing conspiracies everywhere, that the whole matter should be concluded quickly before more damage was done. The pressure intensified in late November when 2 of the men assisting with the search, both day laborers who needed the work, were beaten by masked assailants and told to quit the investigation or face worse. Both men immediately left Ashwood Hollow, too frightened to continue. Robert Pritchard hired armed guards for Brennan, Yoder, and the other investigators. The guards were former soldiers, hard men who wouldn't be intimidated. Their presence prevented further violence but deepened the town's divisions. Ashwood Hollow had become a community at war with itself, torn between those who demanded full accountability and those who wanted the whole nightmare buried and forgotten. Through it all, Isaac Crowley sat in his cell, calmly reading books, eating his meals, sleeping peacefully. He showed no remorse, no anxiety about his coming trial, no concern about his fate. When asked if he feared hanging, he replied, "Fear is an irrational response to the inevitable. I will die someday regardless. Whether by hanging or by old age makes little practical difference." The man who had spent 30 years studying human suffering appeared incapable of experiencing any genuine emotion himself. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, just when we thought Isaac Crowley's depravity had reached its limits, the investigation uncovered something that changed everything we thought we knew about this case. If you're still watching, if you've made it this far through this nightmare, then you're part of something important. You're part of a community that refuses to let these stories stay buried. You're part of the true crime family that believes victims deserve to be remembered, no matter how much time has passed. I need you to share this video right now. Share it before it's too late, before this story gets buried again by algorithms and by people who think the past should stay hidden. These victims, Margaret Schieffer, Finn O'Malley, Alina Pritchard, and the others whose names we may never know, they deserve to have their stories told. Hit that share button. Send this to someone who needs to understand what human beings are capable of when darkness is allowed to operate in plain sight. Because what we're about to reveal in the next part will show you that Isaac Crowley's Chamber of Horrors wasn't the end of this story. The trial, the legal proceedings, what happened to the people who enabled him, either through action or through willful blindness. That's where this story takes its darkest turn. Some people escaped justice, and you need to know who they were and why the system failed. Let's continue. The trial of Isaac Crowley began on January 14, 1861, in the county courthouse in Hazleton. The venue had been moved from Ashwood Hollow due to concerns about both mob violence and the impossibility of finding an impartial jury. in a town that had been torn apart by the investigation. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania charged Crowley with 1 count of kidnapping and 18 counts of murder. They could not charge him with 19 murders because Eleanor Pritchard had survived. The irony was not lost on anyone. Had Crowley succeeded in killing her, had the investigation been delayed by even 1 more day, he would have faced 19 murder charges instead of 18. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Samuel Webster, a meticulous lawyer who had spent 2 months preparing the case. The evidence was overwhelming. Crowley's own journals, the physical evidence from the chamber, the recovered bodies, the testimony of Eleanor Pritchard, and most damning of all, Crowley's own confessions. This should have been a simple trial. It was anything but. Crowley's defense attorney was a man named Jeremiah Stone, hired and paid for by parties who were never publicly identified. Stone was expensive, skilled, and morally flexible. His strategy was not to prove Crowley innocent. That was impossible, but to create enough procedural complications to delay justice indefinitely. Stone filed motion after motion. He challenged the legality of the search of Crowley's property. He argued that the journals had been obtained improperly. He claimed that Crowley's confessions had been coerced. He demanded change of venue, then change of judge, then change of venue again. He filed for continuances based on the need for additional time to prepare, to locate witnesses, to consult with experts. Each motion was ultimately denied, but each one consumed weeks or months. The trial that should have started in January didn't actually begin hearing testimony until April. During this delay, the case began to attract national attention. Newspapers in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston ran sensational stories about the Pennsylvania torture chamber and the Blacksmith of death. Harper's Weekly published detailed illustrations of the underground chamber based on investigators' descriptions. The story became a sensation, a gothic horror made real. This publicity created its own problems. The defense used it to argue that Crowley could not receive a fair trial anywhere in Pennsylvania, that the newspaper coverage had poisoned public opinion. Stone requested that the charges be dismissed entirely due to prejudicial publicity. The request was denied, but it delayed proceedings another 6 weeks. Meanwhile, the identified conspirators, the mysterious WB and TM from Crowley's notes, were never found. Thomas Brennan had compiled a list of everyone in Ashwood Hollow and the surrounding area with those initials. William Brenner, merchant; Walter Becker, farmer; Timothy Mueller, the man whose dog had found the ventilation shaft; Thomas Mayer, the tavern keeper whose son had witnessed Eleanor entering the forge. Brennan interviewed all of them. All denied any knowledge of Crowley's activities. Without Crowley's cooperation, and the blacksmith refused to identify his associates, there was no evidence to pursue charges against anyone else. This meant that if others had enabled Crowley, if anyone had provided him with victims or payment to maintain silence, they would face no consequences. Justice would be incomplete. The trial itself, when it finally proceeded, was a parade of horrors. Eleanor Pritchard testified for 3 hours, describing her ordeal in a quiet, steady voice that never wavered despite the tears streaming down her face. She described waking up in darkness, chained to a wall, not knowing where she was or why. She described the sound of Crowley's footsteps on the stone stairs, the lamplight that hurt her eyes after days of darkness, his calm, conversational tone as he asked her questions about her feelings, her fears, her diminishing hope. He wanted to know when I stopped believing I would be rescued, she testified. He asked me every day, "Do you still have hope, Eleanor?" That's what he would say, and toward the end I didn't. I knew I was going to die down there. I made peace with it, and that seemed to satisfy him. He wrote it down in his book. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of people weeping. Dr. Yoder testified about the physical evidence, the injuries consistent with prolonged restraint, and the careful engineering of the chamber. He described examining the skeletal remains, cataloging the marks of torture on bones. Brennan testified about the investigation, the discovery of the journals, and the excavation of the graves. He read selected passages from Crowley's journals aloud, and several people in the courtroom became physically ill. The defense called no witnesses. Stone's closing argument was brief and focused entirely on legal technicalities. He argued that the journals were hearsay, that the confessions were unreliable, that the prosecution had failed to establish a definitive cause of death for the recovered remains. It was a performance for the record, laying groundwork for appeals. Stone knew he would not win acquittal, but he could potentially win reversal on procedural grounds. The jury deliberated for 47 minutes. They returned verdicts of guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern elderly man named Howard Blackstone, sentenced Isaac Crowley to death by hanging for the murder convictions. The sentence was to be carried out on July 15, 1861. Crowley showed no reaction to the verdict or the sentence. As he was led from the courtroom, he looked back at the gallery and smiled slightly, as if this had all been mildly amusing. But the sentence was never carried out. Stone immediately filed appeals to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, arguing multiple grounds for reversal. The appeals process ground forward with agonizing slowness. Meanwhile, national events intervened. The Civil War had begun in April 1861, just as Crowley's trial was getting underway. By summer, the war consumed all attention and resources. The Ashwood Hollow coal mines, previously marginal operations, became crucial suppliers of anthracite for iron foundries supporting the war effort. The town that had been dying economically in 1860 was booming by 1862. New workers flooded in. New businesses opened. The population tripled in 2 years. Most of these newcomers knew nothing about Isaac Crowley or his Chamber of Horrors. To them, Ashwood Hollow was just another mining town, a place to work and earn wages. The old residents, the ones who remembered, largely chose not to speak of it. The whole nightmare became a source of shame, something to be buried along with the victims. Mayor Donovan, ever the businessman, actively suppressed discussion of the Crowley case. It was bad for business, bad for property values, bad for attracting the investment capital the town needed to expand its mining operations. Newcomers who asked about the boarded-up forge on the east side of town were told it had belonged to a man who'd gone to prison, nothing more. Isaac Crowley remained in prison while his appeals proceeded. He was held in the county jail in Hazleton, kept isolated from other prisoners due to concerns about his safety, or perhaps about what he might do to others. He spent his time reading. The prison chaplain reported that Crowley had requested books on medicine, anatomy, psychology, and natural philosophy. He showed no interest in religious texts or redemption. When the chaplain tried to discuss his soul and salvation, Crowley told him politely that he found the concept of souls to be unsupported by evidence. In June of 1862, Crowley developed a persistent cough. Dr. Yoder, still haunted by his former chess partner's crimes, was called to examine him. The diagnosis was consumption, tuberculosis. It was common in prisons, spread easily in confined spaces, and in the 1860s it was largely untreatable. Crowley deteriorated rapidly. By October, he was bedridden, coughing blood, unable to stand. His appeals were still pending, but it became clear he would not live long enough for them to be resolved. On November 3, 1862, exactly 21 years to the day after his first journal entry documenting Subject 1, Isaac Crowley died in his prison cell. He was 52 years old. His last words, reported by the guard who was with him, were, "The question remains unanswered." What question, the guard didn't know. Perhaps it was the question Crowley had pursued for 3 decades, the true limits of human suffering. He had tortured 19 people, had documented their anguish with scientific precision, and had died believing his research was incomplete. The news of his death brought mixed reactions in Ashwood Hollow. Some felt cheated that he had escaped the hangman's noose, that he had died on his own terms rather than at the end of a rope. Others felt relief that the matter was finally concluded, that the town could move forward without the shadow of a trial and execution hanging over it. Eleanor Pritchard, when told of Crowley's death, said simply, "Good." She had rebuilt her life in the 2 years since her rescue. She had returned to Harrisburg, finished her education, and secured a position as a teacher. The physical scars had healed, but she would wake screaming from nightmares for the rest of her life. She never married, never spoke publicly about her ordeal again. She died in 1891 at the age of 47, of heart failure. Those who knew her said she had never truly recovered, that something essential had been broken in that underground chamber and could never be repaired. The other victims' families received no such closure. Many never learned definitively what had happened to their loved ones. The 4 bodies that were never recovered remained mysteries. Were they at the bottom of Blackwater Creek, bones scattered across miles of streambed? Were they in mine shafts that hadn't been searched? Had Crowley transported them farther away to locations he never recorded? No one knew. No one would ever know. The legal aftermath dragged on for years. Crowley's property was seized by the county. There was talk of destroying the chamber, filling it in completely. But the cost was deemed too high, and instead the entrance was sealed with brick and mortar. The forge was demolished. The house was torn down. The land was sold at auction in 1864 to a mining company that wanted the mineral rights. That mining company, focused only on coal extraction, never bothered to map the old property carefully. When railroad workers stumbled into the chamber in 1875, 13 years after Crowley's death, it took authorities 3 days to even realize what they had found. The records had been sealed, the story had been buried, and institutional memory had faded. The discovery in 1875 triggered a new investigation and a new wave of publicity. Newspapers that had covered the original trial in 1861 ran follow-up stories. The Pennsylvania Horror Chamber Rediscovered read one headline. The 17 boxes of sealed evidence were unsealed, examined again, and then resealed for another 43 years by court order. Why seal the records? The official reason was to protect the privacy of victims' families. The unofficial reason, whispered but never proven, was that those records contained names of prominent citizens who had known about Crowley's activities or had been complicit in covering them up. Sealing the records protected the guilty as much as the innocent. Reforms came slowly, if at all. The Pennsylvania legislature passed no new laws in response to the Crowley case. No procedures were implemented to track missing persons more effectively. The sheriff's office in Ashwood Hollow received no additional funding or training. The only lasting change was in the collective memory of those who had lived through it, a permanent scar of knowledge that evil could operate invisibly, that monsters could live next door wearing the face of a trusted neighbor, and the haunting certainty that somewhere in some isolated community it was probably happening again. Because Isaac Crowley had been caught only by accident, only because he made one impulsive mistake after 3 decades of careful planning. How many others like him, more patient and more careful, had never been caught at all? That question remained unanswered. The story of Isaac Crowley and his underground chamber forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, community complicity, and the systems we trust to protect us. The most disturbing aspect of Crowley's crimes was not their brutality, though that was considerable. It was their duration. 32 years. 3 decades of systematic torture and murder conducted in plain sight, in a small town where everyone knew everyone, where strangers were noticed and gossip traveled fast. How was this possible? The answer lies in understanding the social dynamics that allowed, even enabled, Crowley's operation. He succeeded because he understood a fundamental truth: people see what they expect to see. A respected blacksmith, a church-going craftsman, a charitable neighbor. These identities created a cognitive shield that made people incapable of perceiving the monster underneath. When warning signs appeared, they were rationalized away. When people disappeared, their absences were explained through convenient narratives. They wandered off, they moved on, they met with accidents. The human mind resists contradictions that challenge comfortable assumptions. It was easier to believe in tragic coincidences than to suspect a trusted neighbor of unspeakable evil. This cognitive bias remains as powerful today as it was in 1841. We still struggle to recognize predators who operate from positions of trust. The respected coach, the beloved teacher, the pillar of the community. We resist believing they could be capable of harm until the evidence becomes overwhelming and undeniable. Crowley's case also reveals the vulnerability of marginalized people. He selected victims whose disappearances wouldn't trigger thorough investigations. Vagrants, drifters, people without powerful family connections, those whom society had already begun to forget. This pattern repeats throughout history. Those on society's margins remain the most vulnerable to predation precisely because their suffering generates the least institutional response. The community's divided response to the discovery, some demanding full accountability, others wanting the story buried, reflects a tension that persists in how societies handle revelations of systemic evil. There's always a faction that prioritizes reputation over justice, economic stability over truth, moving forward over looking back. Ashwood Hollow chose to forget. The records were sealed. The story was suppressed. Newcomers were never told the full history of the land they walked on. This choice protected the guilty and dishonored the dead. Why was this story hidden for so long? The official explanation involves privacy and sensitivity to victims' families. But the truth is darker and more mundane. Shame. Collective shame that a community had harbored such evil unknowingly. Shame that friends and neighbors had been deceived so thoroughly. Shame that some had suspected something but remained silent out of social pressure or self-interest. That shame manifested as silence, and silence enabled forgetting, and forgetting meant that no meaningful lessons were learned. The records sealed in 1875 weren't opened until 1918, when the last of Crowley's contemporaries had died, and the story had faded into local legend, half remembered and doubted. When researchers finally examined those 17 boxes, they found not just evidence of Crowley's crimes, but documentation of the community's complicity, not in the crimes themselves, necessarily, but in the willful blindness that allowed them to continue. There were people who had suspected, people who had noticed patterns but convinced themselves they were imagining things, people who had felt uneasy about Crowley but couldn't articulate why. People who had seen small, strange things but never connected them into a larger picture. Their silence had a cost measured in lives. The question we must ask ourselves, the question that makes this 160-year-old story relevant today, is this: what are we not seeing right now? What evil operates in our communities, hidden behind respectability and social trust? Who is suffering in silence while we go about our comfortable lives, never noticing because the truth would be too disturbing to accept? Isaac Crowley's Chamber of Horrors was extraordinary in its scale and duration. but the mechanisms that allowed it to exist, social conformity, cognitive bias, the marginalization of vulnerable people, the prioritization of reputation over justice. These remain ordinary features of human societies. The horror isn't just what one man did in darkness. It's what entire communities choose not to see in broad daylight. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer before you type it in the comments. Do you believe Isaac Crowley acted completely alone? Think about the logistics. Think about the references in his journals to WB and TM. Think about how a man could maintain such an operation for 3 decades without anyone truly noticing. Think about who benefited from sealing those records for 43 years. The official story says Crowley was a lone monster who happened to get caught. But what if the truth is more disturbing? What if there were others who knew, who helped, who profited from his silence? What if those 17 boxes contained names that would have destroyed powerful families, ended political careers, shattered the reputations of men who died, respected and mourned? We'll never know for certain. The people who sealed those records made sure of that. But here's what I believe. Evil rarely operates in complete isolation. It requires enablers, people who look the way, people who choose comfort over courage. Tell me in the comments, what do you think really happened? Do you believe the full truth was ever revealed? And what modern parallels do you see to this story? If you've made it this far, if you've had the courage to face this nightmare alongside me, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel needs. Hit that subscribe button right now, because next week we're uncovering another buried story, another horror that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. We're going to investigate the widow's home. The Denver baby farm murders of 1893, 17 infants, one respectable woman. A garden that held secrets the city tried desperately to forget. You think Isaac Crowley was disturbing? Wait until you hear what happened in Denver. Thank you for your bravery in listening to this story. Thank you for refusing to let these victims be forgotten. Eleanor Pritchard, Margaret Schieffer, Finn O'Malley, and all the others whose names we may never know. They deserved better than the silence they were given. We're giving them a voice even if it comes 160 years too late. Share this video, share their story, and I'll see you next week. Stay vigilant, stay questioning, and remember, the monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they're the respected craftsman who shoes your horse and smile when you wish him good morning.